Hello everyone. So in today's video, we will be building an expense tracker application using React and Zustand. So we will be using Zustand for our state management and React for the UI. So this is the expense tracker application that you see. We have a list of expenses. We can add a new expense, we can edit an expense, and we can delete the expense. And like down here, you can see the total of all the expenses which are in the list. So if I add a new expense here, let's say milk, 450. Add expense, you see we have an added expense of milk. If I try to edit an expense, let's say I edit movie and I call it cinema and I update it with 600. So when we have clicked on edit expense, so the text of this button also changed to edit. I will click on it and you see we are getting cinema and 600 and the total is also reflecting like correctly. So and if I try to delete some items, so we are able to delete them as well. Apart from this, I will also show you how you can integrate Redux DevTools to efficiently track the state of your app. So you can see we have expenses and total, and as and when we play with the application, this gets affected. So you can see the chart and the tree in Redux DevTools. I will show you how to add this middleware in Zustand. And regarding the Zustand workflow, we will be following this workflow. This is a very basic Zustand workflow. So we have to create a store, then we have to define state, create some setters, consume state, update state, and we can add middlewares as well. So we will be following this workflow for integrating Zustand in our React project. So it is going to be very interesting. So I really hope you enjoy watching this tutorial and you learn how to integrate Zustand with your React app. Apart from this, whatever code I have written, like the component I have written and the styles I have applied to it. So all the links to those styles and the component code will be present in the description, so you can check that out. All right, so let's now dive into the code directly. Okay, so I have opened a new folder called expense tracker, and herein I will create a new React project using Vite. So I'll say yarn create Vite. For the project name, I will use the same project name. I will say React, JavaScript, and I will also do yarn once. Okay, so this is done. And as we are using Zustand for this project, so I will also add Zustand in it. I'll say yarn add Zustand. And in the dependencies, you can see we have Zustand added here as well. Okay, so now moving on. In my source folder, firstly what I'll do, I will create a new folder called store, right? Inside this, I will create a new file called store.js. So we do not need this, so I will remove this template. And I will simply say hi. And I will also remove anything else from here. Also, I will be removing any of the styles that are pre-applied. So I will just delete this file. We don't want this. And in the main.jsx, we have our app. And for the index.jsx as well, I will delete this file. And I will remove it from here. Cool. Let's run the project and see. Okay, so as you can see, we are getting simple hi here, no styles applied, nothing. So we have our basic React project set up. Now inside my source folder, I will create a new folder called components. Inside this, I will create a new file called expense tracker.jsx. I will do RAFCE, save it, and import this in my app. So instead of hi, I will return expense tracker, and let's see once we are getting expense tracker. And now I will start with creating the basic structure for our expense tracker app. So I will say h5 expense tracker, and I will add a div here that will have a class name of container. Inside this div, I will have multiple divs. So firstly, there would be a div that will have a class name of add expense box. Inside this, I'm going to have two inputs, one for the name of the expense and another one for the amount that we have to enter, and third one would be the button. So on clicking that button, that expense would be added to our list. So I will create 3 inputs quickly. Okay, so as you can see, we have 2 inputs, enter expense, enter amount, and a button called add expense. Right. So after this div, I will have another div that will have a class name of expense list box. So inside this, we will be listing all the expenses that we have. So I will be mapping over our expense list and showing it here. And the last div that we are going to have is for showing the total. That will look something like this. So on the top level, you can see we have a container div inside which we have a div for add expense box. So this div, which has 2 inputs and a button. Then we have an expense list box. You can't see it because there is nothing in it. And then we have a total, right? So now I will quickly add some styles, and regarding the styles, whatever styles I'm applying, you can find the link to those styles in the description. Okay, so these are the styles that I'm going to apply, and I will just import my style sheet. So I will say import dot slash styles.css. And you see, as soon as I've applied the style, we are getting a beautiful UI like this. So now comes the interesting part. We would be configuring Zustand for our app. On the right side, you can see I have the Zustand workflow that we would be following. So the first step in this workflow is to create a store. Basically, we'll set up a store. For that, I will import an utility called create from Zustand, and I will say const use store is equal to create. This will basically take a callback function which will have set as a parameter, and it expects us to return an object, right? So this is the basic thing. So one thing we can do is we can like create this function that will be returning us an object outside of this create utility as well. I would be showing you how to do that, but let's for now create this object. And also we need to export this use store from this file. So we have said export, right? Now the second step is to define state. So as you know, we are maintaining a list of expenses. So I would be saying something like expenses. This would be an array of objects. Let's add some dummy expenses in it. For example, I will say name of the expense is movie, and the amount is, let's say, 1000. Like that, I will add one more object. So this is just the dummy data that we are adding. Apart from this, we also want to show the total, right? So whatever the total is, so I will say total, and let's say for now I will keep it as 1000. We will configure it later. Okay. The third step is to create setters. So setters, you can think of them like as reducers we use in Redux. So here they are called as setter methods. So I will create 3 setter methods, one for adding the expense, another for editing the expense, and the third one will be for deleting the expense. So let's see how we can add those. I will say add expense. This will be a function that will take basically the name of the expense and the amount that we are going to pass it. So I will say name comma amount. This is a function, right? So it expects us to return something. I will say set. This is a set that we are getting from here, and inside this it takes a callback function which has the inherent state in it, and it expects us to return an object inside which firstly I will spread the already existing state, and what I'll do, I'll say expenses. So I will modify the already existing expenses. So I'll say dot 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 state dot expenses comma name comma amount. So here what I've done is I've created a normal function called add expense, which will take 2 parameters, name and amount. So this is the set we are getting from here. So it is used to update the state. So it is inherently taking a state in a callback function, which expects us to return an object. So in the updated object, we have spreaded our previous state, and I have updated the expenses in which I have spreaded the already existing expenses. and I'm adding a new object here. So this is a new expense that we are adding through this name and amount. So that will also get appended to this array. So our expenses array will, if I call add expense, so it will create another object with name and amount in it. Another important thing, like we will be mapping over these expenses. So these need some ID, right? So that we can efficiently map over them. So I will just quickly assign some IDs to it. And while creating a new object as well, I want to assign a random ID to it. So I will just say ID yes date.now. Editing an expense, we will need something like edit expense. This will be a function again. This will take an ID now, because whenever we are editing an expense, we will be needing its ID, name, and amount. So these will be the updated name and amount that we want to give it. Okay, again, I will be saying set. This will take a callback function. It will have a state inherently. It expects us to return an object. But before returning the object, what we will be doing is I will be performing some operations, and after that I will return an object like this. I will say const updated expenses is equal to state dot expenses dot map. I will map over each expense, and I will check if expense dot id is triple equal to the id that we are getting. If that's true, then I will simply return an object spreading the expense name and the updated amount. Otherwise, I will simply return the old expense. And once I have done this, so now I will return the updated state that will have old state, and expenses will be updated expenses, right? So edit expense is also done. What I've done is I've simply taken an ID, the new name, the new amount that we would be modifying our expense with, and I've used set. So it takes a callback function which has a state in it, and I've created a new array of updated expenses by iterating over the old expenses array. And whenever I'm finding an expense matching this ID, I'm just updating that with the new values that I'm getting here. Otherwise, I'm just returning the old expense that is there. So I'm not modifying the expenses where the ID does not match. I hope you understand this. And I'm just returning the updated state here. Cool. I will say delete an expense. Delete expense. This will just take an ID. I will say set. Set will have a state. Inside this, I will say const updated expenses is equal to, this time I will basically use filter to filter out the expense where ID is matching. So I will say state dot expenses dot filter, and for each expense dot id not equal to the ID that I'm getting, then I will simply return that. Basically, let's say we have expenses with ID 1, 2, 3, and I want to delete an expense with the ID of 3. So whenever the ID of 3 is not matching, so like for the expenses 1 and 2, this will satisfy, like 1 and 2 are not matching 3. So I will put it in updated expenses. But for the third ID, this condition will not satisfy. This will be false. So that will not go into updated expenses. And I will just simply copy this, and I will say return state and expenses. Alright, so we are done with our setup functions. Now coming to the computation of this total. So I will just say total is 0, and for the computation of total, like whenever we are adding a new expense, so we want to modify this total as well. After I have updated the expense, so I will say total is state dot total plus amount. So we have to keep in mind, like whenever we are adding an expense, we are also updating our total in the state that we have. So state dot total plus amount. And when we have edited an expense, so obviously the amount would be changed. So the updated expenses that we are getting, I will say const updated total is equal to updated expenses dot reduce. This will take two values, an accumulator and current value, for which I will simply say accumulator is equal to accumulator plus current value dot amount, and I will return accumulator. So if you do not know how reduce works, so you can check out my video on reduce. So I've also covered its polyfill, like how it works internally, so that you can get a better understanding of it. And I will simply say total is updated total. Cool. I will do the same thing here as well. So I will just copy paste this and here as well, because when we are deleting an expense, again the total is to be impacted. So we are just recomputing the total by like going through our updated expenses, and we are like calculating the amount for each expense that we have, and we are just updating it. Our store setup is done. We have created the setters. So next step is to consume this. So how we can consume it? Let's see. Consuming means nothing but just to use the state that we have created. So I will say const, let's say expenses and total I want. I will call uStore. So this is the uStore that we have exported from here. So as you can see, export const uStore. I have just imported it and I am destructuring expenses and total from it. Now, just to show you, if I quickly say total, let's see what we have. So initially we have 0. So let's say if I change it to 1000 and save it, you can see we are getting 1000 here. And regarding the expenses, I will now map these expenses here. I will say expenses dot map. So I have mapped over my expenses array and I have taken the expense and the index from it. So I've created a div with a class name of expense item, in which I have two h4s. So for the name of the expense and for the amount of the expense. And for these icons of edit and delete, I'm using this span. So both these spans have a class name of icon. And styles, as you know, you will get the style sheet link in the description. So do not worry about that. So now our basic structure, basic styling, our Zustand store setup, everything is complete. Now we will add the functionality of adding a new expense to it. So how we will do it, let's see. For this expense and this amount, I will create two states here. So I will say const expense name comma set expense name is equal to uState. I will import it. Initially this will be empty, and for the amount, set amount, and initially let's say it to be 0. And in these input boxes, I will say on change is equal to set expense name as e dot target dot value. And for this enter amount as well, I will add an on change event listener that will have set amount as e dot target dot value. And now we will make this add expense button functional. So I will attach an on click listener here. I will say on click is equal to handle add expense, right? And I will create this function. On the top, I will say const handle add expense. So this will basically call the add expense setter that we created. So I will also extract it, add expense. As you can see in our store, we had, this is our object, we had expenses, total, and this add expense function in it. So that is what I'm extracting here. And I will just call this function add expense with the expense name and the amount, right? So this should work. Let's see. Also, once I've added the expense, I want to clear the input boxes. So this will be empty and this will be 0. Let's say I add an expense of shopping and 5,000. If I click on add expense, so you see shopping and 5,000, but this is not being cleared. So let's see why. Okay, because we haven't provided it a value. So value it will take from expense name, and let's set this use amount as a string as well, and this will be string, and here as well I will say value is equal to amount. Now if I add another expense here, let's say milk 100, add expense, this is cleared and we are able to get expense here. So now you must be seeing a bug here. So we are getting, like, we are not getting the total of it, rather we are just appending this. Basically these are getting appended, all the amounts. So for that, basically what we are doing is when we are setting this amount, so this is getting set as a string. So what we can do here is we can say parse int amount, and I will just copy this, and wherever we are using amount I can just paste it there, like here as well. So now if I try to add something, let's say shopping 1000, add expense, we are getting 1000, but we are only getting 1000 here. We should be getting all these values. So if I just remove this, because initially we won't be having any expense, I will again say, let's say game 100, cool. Let's say milk 500. Okay, now you see we are getting the total correctly. So now we will work on the functionality of editing these. So upon clicking this edit button, firstly these values like the name of the expense and amount should go and sit in these input boxes, and the text of this button should change to edit expense. And upon clicking this button, so if we are editing an expense, so that should edit that expense and reflect it here, right? So let's see how we can achieve that functionality. So I will introduce an on click here. On click is equal to handle edit expense. I will pass in two values here. Firstly the index, and secondly the expense ID. Right? Let's copy this. I will say const handle edit expense. This will take an index and expense ID. Right. And I will maintain a state here, const expense ID, comma, set expense ID is equal to use state, that will be null initially. And what I'll do inside this, I will set the expense ID to be expense ID. And based on this flag, we will toggle the text of the button. So if expense ID is not null, then I will show edit expense. Otherwise, I will show add expense. And also I want to set the values here. So, but first let's check if this button thing is working. So if I click on this edit, you see the text has changed to edit. Now coming to the values, so I will say set expense name to be expenses of index dot name, and set amount to be expenses of index dot amount. And also we are passing the values here. So the first input box is taking its value from expense name state, and the amount one is taking from the amount state that we have created. So I think it is clear. Now if I click on a button, let's say grocery, edit. So you see we are getting grocery and the amount here correctly, and the button text has been changed to edit. Cool. Now coming to this handle add expense. So upon clicking this edit expense, I want to edit the expense and not add a new expense like this. So if you remember, we have created an edit expense setter here. So we will use this. To use this, I will first destructure it, edit expense, and herein I will add a check. If expense ID is not null, then what I'll do, I will call this edit expense with the expense ID, the expense name, and the amount. And further, I will set this expense ID to be null again. Else, I will simply do add expense. So you see, we have the same button, but the functionality will depend on this expense ID flag. Upon clicking this edit button, I am setting the expense ID. That means it is no longer null. So when I will when I will click this button will check if we are in the edit mode. That means expense ID is not null. If yes, then we will call this setter function. If no, then we are calling this setter function, that is a normal add expense. I hope it is clear. Let's see. I click on this edit. Okay. I will try to edit this. I will say game edit 1001. If I click on this, so you see game edit, and this is like updated, and we are also getting the older text on the button. Right, so you can play around with this. So the total is also getting affected clearly. If I just change it to 10,000, if I click on edit, so we are getting 10,000 plus 2,000, that is 12,000. So this is working fine. Okay, so the last thing that we are left with is this cross button. So we want to delete this from here. So if you remember, we have created a delete expense setter in Zustand. So I will destructure it, delete expense. And what I'll say is, on this icon, I will say on click is equal to, I will directly call this with the expense ID, so expense.id. Let's see if this works. If I click on this, okay, cool. If I click on this, cool. So regarding our Zustand workflow, we have seen all the things. We have consumed the state as well using useStore, and we have updated our state using setters. So the last thing that is remaining is middleware configuration. So middleware, like we have Redux DevTools. So if I now refresh my page, I click on Redux DevTools. So you will see it will say that it is not configured, no store found. So let's see how we can configure Redux DevTools. For that, I will go to my store. I will import DevTools from Zustand middleware. And while creating this store, I will wrap this with DevTools. And here also I will give a closing bracket. Right, so this was how we can add a middleware to our Zustand store. So if I now show you, first I will refresh the page. We'll go to Redux DevTools, and you see we are getting our state here. So expenses and total we are getting correctly. So if you see now on the right side, I have my Redux DevTools. So if I add an expense, chips 500, add expense, and you see an action was dispatched, and in the expenses we have a new object with ID, name, and amount. So if I just show you the chart, so in the expense we have one expense added. If I now delete this, so you see one sort of setter was triggered. So just like an action is dispatched in Redux, a setter was triggered in Zustand. And if I show you the state, so the expenses are empty. So you can play around with Redux DevTools. It is a quite useful when you are working with the state management tool like Redux or Zustand. So it is quite helpful. You can check it out. Yes, so this was our small expense tracker app. Obviously, you can play around with it more. So you can add more setters in it. You can introduce more state variables. And regarding the UI as well, you can tweak the UI to introduce more features in this. And yes, so this is done and it is working like a charm. So I hope you enjoyed this code walkthrough for using Zustand in our expense tracker app, and you understood this workflow. Like, it is a quite straightforward workflow when we compare it to Redux. So yes, that was it from my side. See you in the next one. Thanks for watching.